This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 720 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Basketball season is going strong, which means Wednesday nights are jam-packed with NBA action. And FanDuel and Buzzer plan on giving you a chance to win big with their daily fantasy basketball contest. Introducing the NBA Clutch Shot presented by Buzzer, an NBA DFS contest taking place every Wednesday from now until March that gives you a chance to win a share of FanDuel's biggest prize pool. Simply construct your best 9-player roster while staying under the salary cap and follow along as the games unfold using FanDuel's live scoring feature. Earn points for points scored, rebounds, assists, steals, and blocks, and watch as your lineup climbs the ranks. The higher up the leaderboard your lineup finishes, the more cash you'll win. It's that simple. The contest is live, so visit FanDuel.com/league/NBA-main-marquee-1 and submit your lineups now. That's FanDuel.com/league/NBA-main-marquee-1. As a reminder, I know your trade deadlines have likely passed, but you can use these buy and sell transactions for confidence purposes. If a player's a sell, then you know that there's a chance that he doesn't do as well down the stretch, and vice versa. That can dictate your planning. With that being said, it is a 15-transaction show. Let's get to it. Sell the Jacksonville Jaguars passing attack. You could easily argue that Jacksonville has the toughest fantasy football playoff schedule for passing attacks. In fact, that's what my adjusted fantasy points allowed numbers say. In Week 15, Jacksonville gets Dallas. The Cowboys have been the second toughest matchup for quarterbacks this year within that adjusted fantasy points allowed metric. And they're top 7 against wide receivers. The next week, they get the Jets. Quarterbacks have not been good against New York. The Jets are 4th best against the position in adjusted fantasy points allowed. And wide receivers have been even worse. The Jets are the absolute toughest matchup for wide receivers in fantasy football. And they wrap up the season against the Texans. Teams are running the ball against Houston. They're now the toughest matchup for quarterbacks in adjusted fantasy points allowed. They're the 3rd hardest for wide receivers. Houston's actually allowed just 2 QB1 performances this year. And those QB1s were Jalen Hurts and Justin Herbert. Now, Jacksonville's Week 14 matchup against Tennessee, totally fine. But I do think the passing attack has a real chance to struggle during the fantasy playoffs. Add James Cook. So we've been gradually seeing James Cook get more involved in this Bills offense. But things really came together in Week 13. He was on the field for about 43% of Buffalo's snaps. His previous season high was 26.5%. He ended up handling 48% of Buffalo's running back rushes. He had an 18% target share. He's actually now had target shares of 12% and 18% over his last 2. And his 16.5 PPR points against New England this past week, by far his best finish of the season. So given the way things are trending, he definitely should be added. I would not be surprised if he gets more and more work in this backfield. We just should be open to the possibility that he just hurts Devin Singletary more than has standalone value. That's a very real outcome. Add Cam Akers. So back in Week 12, it was Kyren Williams in that Rams backfield. But in Week 13, it was Cam Akers. And to me, there's a very obvious reason as to why this happened. Game script. 2 weeks ago against the Chiefs, the Rams played 49 of their offensive plays while trailing. 30 of them happened while they were trailing by 10 or more points. This past week against Seattle, the Rams did run 42 plays while trailing. But none of them were down by a lot of points. Because the game was a lot closer. That game script allowed the early down Akers to play 73% of LA's snaps. That was easily a season high for him. Kyren Williams, after playing 70% of their snaps in Week 12, he was down to 27% in Week 13. Because he's the pass catcher in that backfield. Now, we've seen this back and forth from the Rams offense all year. It's very frustrating. Given the state of this offense, it's really hard to feel bullish about any running back in this backfield. With that being said, they get the Raiders in Week 14. That's a top 5 matchup. So Akers might have some flex appeal. Buy Marquise Brown. So the Cardinals had a bye in Week 13, but back in Week 12, we saw some good things from Hollywood Brown. He led the team in targets coming off that injury. He had a 30% target share. He only scored 10.6 PPR points, but that was really encouraging usage considering it was the first game that he played with DeAndre Hopkins. Now, hopefully Rondale Moore is eventually back too. And maybe that slightly hurts the target share ceiling for Marquise Brown and DeAndre Hopkins. But the Cardinals wide receivers have the 5th most attractive fantasy playoff schedule when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed. And that's because in week 16 and 17, they have good matchups against Tampa Bay and Atlanta. Add Corey Davis. So Corey Davis was featured on last week's Sleeper Show. And the logic behind that play was that Minnesota was really bad against perimeter wide receivers. And that's exactly what Davis is. That's what he plays on the Jets. He's a perimeter wideout. But he's also the number 2 wide receiver on that team. Despite what Elijah Moore did back in week 12, Corey Davis was on the field a lot more. He ended up catching 5 passes for 85 yards against the Vikings. This shift to Mike White, it's provided a much, much better floor and ceiling for Jets pass catchers. And from weeks 14 through 16, the Jets have a pretty favorable schedule. They get matchups against Buffalo, Detroit, and Jacksonville. Those aren't bad matchups for wide receivers. So as the second option in New York's passing attack, I think that Davis should be rostered in most 12-team leagues. Sell Geno Smith. Now look, I love Geno Smith. It's kind of hard to not love Geno Smith. It's hard to not love the story going on in Seattle. Smith has now finished as a top 12 quarterback in 5 consecutive games. He's been a QB1 in each of his last 5. He's been one of the best quarterbacks in all of football this year. But there is some reason for concern as we get closer to the fantasy playoffs. During this month-long stretch, Smith hasn't really faced difficult matchups. His matchup against the Rams in week 13 was the hardest matchup that he's faced on paper, according to adjusted fantasy points allowed. But they weren't the same unit. Aaron Donald didn't even play. There are 2 games in the fantasy playoffs that are concerning. In week 15, the Seahawks get San Francisco. That's a bottom 5 opponent for quarterbacks in adjusted fantasy points allowed. Week 16 is a good one. They get Kansas City. You can play them against Kansas City. But they finish the year against the Jets, a team I just talked about. So that's 2 bottom 5 matchups for Smith across the 3-week playoff. And one of those teams, the 49ers, they held Smith to just 6 fantasy points earlier in the season. Now you might want to hold on to him because of that week 16 game against the Chiefs. And he should be fine against Carolina this week. I just think we should temper expectations in total for the fantasy playoffs. Add Jahan Dotson. So things are pointing in the right direction for Jahan Dotson right now. In week 13, he played 79% of Washington's offensive snaps, his highest snap share since week 3, and he ended up seeing 22.5% of the team's targets. That's his highest target share of the season. It may be tough to get reliable production from him down the stretch, but he's a talented player. And what do we do with talented players who are seeing volume? We roster them. Hold DeAndre Swift. So this identical transaction hit this same 15 transactions list just a few weeks ago. But there's a little bit more meaning to it now. Because on Sunday, DeAndre Swift had his best fantasy outing since week 1. He scored over 20 PPR points, and it wasn't a fluke. Most of you with Swift, you're probably thinking, I can't rely on this guy rest of season. If the trade deadline hadn't passed, I'd be trading him this week. Because he's coming off a big game. And Jamal Williams keeps scoring goal line touchdowns. But I think that you can be way more optimistic than that. Because Swift played over 51% of Detroit's snaps on Sunday. That's his highest snap share since week 8. And that resulted in a 52% running back rush share and a 15% target share. Those were his best backfield share numbers of the entire season. All the while, Jamal Williams played his lowest snap share of the year this past weekend. He escaped with a touchdown because that's what he does, but his 41% running back rush share was far lower than his 67% share the week prior. The Lions have a really favorable fantasy playoff schedule for running backs. It would not surprise me one bit if DeAndre Swift has a big December. Add Greg Dulcich. So after 3 straight pretty mediocre performances, fantasy managers probably gave up on Greg Dulcich. And then he Undertaker.gift everyone. He had 6 catches for 85 yards against the Ravens. He had a 38% target share. Now, route participation has not really been the issue for Dulcich. He's been top 10 in the league in tight end routes run since coming back from his injury in week 6. The Broncos' offense is just horrible. So there's going to be up and down production. But Courtland Sutton did hurt his hamstring in that game. So maybe we see a little bit more looks funneled Dulcich's way. Add DJ Chark. So this transaction was first going to be used on a Seahawks running back. But so much is up in the air right now with that backfield. It's to the point where I have no idea what to even say on the topic. Kenneth Walker might not play next week. Travis Homer might not play. Same with DJ Dallas. So is Tony Jones the ad? As of right now, I guess. But that could change literally tomorrow. It could change an hour after this podcast is released. So with the Seahawks backfield, you have to just monitor the information. Hopefully we get more information before waivers run. So rather than trying to create all those hypotheticals, let's just pivot and let's talk about DJ Chark. Chark has seen a 14% and 15% target share over his last 2 games. That's resulted in 11 total targets. This week, he gets a very, very beatable Minnesota secondary. The same one I talked about with Corey Davis. They've been bad against perimeter wide receivers this year, and they rank as the 3rd best matchup for wide receivers in adjusted fantasy points allowed. So in a game with a high over-under, at the very least, DJ Chark makes for sort of a streaming wide receiver option. Buy Pat Freiermuth. So considering his peripherals, Pat Freiermuth hasn't been as good as you'd probably expect in fantasy football. He scored fewer than 10 PPR points in 3 of his last 5, averaging 10 PPR points per game. That's fine enough for a tight end, but it's not elite. His usage, though, has been pretty good. Since Chase Claypool was dealt to Chicago, Freiermuth has seen a target share per game just below 23%. He's being used a little bit more in the slot, which is allowing for more passing game involvement. Now, tight ends who see volume are hard to find. But Freiermuth also has a top 5 tight end schedule from here on out. That's according to my adjusted fantasy points allowed method. He's not Travis Kelce, but you should feel fine with Freiermuth as your top tight end. Add Daniel Bellinger. Another tight end that you could look to this week is Daniel Bellinger. I think that Greg Dulcich would be the priority over him, but Bellinger returned from injury on Sunday, and he saw an 18% target share. He ran the 3rd most routes in the Giants, and this Giants team doesn't have a lot of pass catchers. So it would make sense for them to keep him involved down the stretch. And because it's hard to find tight ends getting looks, he should be added. Add Ryan Tannehill. So Ryan Tannehill is not the most appealing fantasy quarterback. I totally get it. But there's reason to like him in week 14. The Titans get the Jags in a game where Tennessee's implied team total, it's at least a respectable 23 points according to FanDuel Sportsbook. Jacksonville's the 8th best matchup for quarterbacks in adjusted fantasy points allowed. You might look at Tannehill's recent performances and want to avoid him. And that's totally reasonable. That's a reasonable response. He's a streamer after all. It's just a really rough week for streamers. And it's also important to know that over his last 4 games, he's faced teams that rank as the 27th, 24th, 25th, and 30th best matchups for quarterbacks. This season, Tennessee's faced the 3rd hardest schedule by adjusted fantasy points allowed for quarterbacks. Tannehill has only faced 1 top 10 matchup. And in that game, he scored about 19 fantasy points. Now, it'd be great if Treylon Burks could play this game, but that's probably unlikely given that awful hit that he took on Sunday. Even still, during a rough week with streamers, I think that Tannehill works. Add the Los Angeles Chargers defense. So you probably remember a handful of weeks ago, I talked about this Chargers defense being a good stash. According to Yahoo, they're rostered in just 21% of leagues right now, so I want to bring it back up. They get matchups against the Titans, Colts, and Rams during weeks 15 through 17. Those are 3 pretty good matchups. With that being said, you might want to not use them against Tennessee. Derrick Henry might run all over them. But the Colts and the Rams are top 3 matchups for fantasy defenses and adjusted fantasy points allowed. So in weeks 16 and 17, the Chargers could work. Add the Pittsburgh Steelers defense. If you need a defense just for this week, Pittsburgh definitely works. Lamar Jackson is trending towards being out this weekend. That means Tyler Huntley is the team's starter. You might remember Huntley's big 35-point performance last year, and you might think to yourself, this isn't that big of a downgrade. But I was shocked to see his numbers from last year. They were not very good. I was talking to Number Fire's Jim Sonis about this, and he noted that Huntley's expected points added per dropback last year was minus 0.12. It was not good. In his 5 games with 30-plus attempts last season, opposing defenses ranked in the top 10 in weekly scoring in 4 of them. This Baltimore-Pittsburgh game has just a 36.5 point over-under. Pittsburgh's a 3-point favorite according to FanDuel Sportsbook. So the Steelers, with TJ Watt back, they get a backup quarterback whose team has an implied team total south of 17 points. They make a ton of sense this week. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Remember to check out lateround.com. Otherwise, I'll talk to you tomorrow with the Weekly 10 Trend Show.